The air on the plains of Irene was thick with the smell of damp earth and ozone. Two groups stood facing each other across a field of blue grass. On one side was the human colony from New Busan. On the other was the Cathari Concordance. They were tall, reptilian people with smooth gray scales and large, dark eyes. Their leader was named Vectar. He watched the humans with a calm, superior look. Today was the day of the peace accord. No more fighting over the planet's rich minerals and forests. The Galactic Council had ordered it. The most important rule of the accord was about weapons. The treaty document was very clear. It banned any weapon system that used controlled plasma, directed energy, projectile acceleration beyond a certain speed, or computers that could aim by themselves. The Cathari were masters of such technology. Their soldiers carried plasma casters that could melt rock. Their personal energy shields could stop any fast-moving object. Vectar raised a three-fingered hand. In a smooth, clicking language, he gave an order. All across the Cathari line, warriors began to power down their weapons. A low hum filled the air as glowing plasma cores dimmed and went dark. The shimmering, faint bubbles of their personal shields flickered and disappeared. They carefully placed their advanced weapons into large metal containers. The containers sealed with a hiss. Vectar felt a pang of vulnerability, but also pride. They were following the rules. They were civilized. He turned his gaze to the humans. He expected to see them doing the same, deactivating their railguns, their laser rifles, their missile launchers. Instead, he saw confusion. The humans were opening large cargo crates made of a dull metal. They were not pulling out complex machines. They were pulling out shapes of wood and polished material that looked strangely old. A human woman stepped forward. Her name was Sujin. She was the diplomat. She wore simple, practical clothes. She held a data pad in her hand. "Overseer Vectar," she said. Her voice amplified by a small device on her collar. "On behalf of New Busan, we present our compliance with the weapons clause of the Irene Peace Accord." She offered the data pad. Vectar took it, his claws tapping on the screen. It was filled with technical readouts, schematics, and chemical analyses. He understood most of it. The schematics showed devices that were shockingly simple. Levers, arms, strings, and counterweights. No power sources. No plasma chambers. The material analysis showed treated wood, a carbon fiber composite, high-tensile synthetic polymers, and forged steel. All basic, solid materials. Nothing that broke the rules. "This is a joke," Vectar said, his voice a low rumble. "Where are your real weapons?" Sujin smiled a small, polite smile. "These are our compliance weapons, Overseer. They meet all treaty requirements. Would you like a demonstration of their operational parameters?" Before Vectar could answer, an older human man walked up. This was Jinwoo. He had a calm face and moved with a slow, sure purpose. He did not look like a soldier. He looked like a teacher. Behind him, two younger humans were assembling something large from the crates. It had a long wooden arm, a heavy frame, and a large bucket at one end. "What is that thing?" Vectar asked, pointing. "This," Jinwoo said, his voice quiet but clear, "is a traction catapult, a type of trebuchet. It is a gravity-powered engine." Jinwoo walked over to the machine as the others finished tightening bolts. He placed a smooth, round stone weighing about 20 kilograms into the leather sling of the bucket. He then attached several heavy weights to the short end of the arm. "The treaty," Jinwoo explained, "states no projectile acceleration beyond 1 kilometer per second squared from a power source. This machine uses gravity. The falling weights provide the force. The arm is a lever. The sling increases the throw. All physics. No plasma. No rails. No chemical explosives. It is a machine that throws a rock. According to the schematics we have provided, its acceleration profile is well within the legal limit." Vectar stared. He looked from the crude machine to his own sleek, deactivated plasma cannons. A feeling of absurdity washed over him. The humans were serious. "You intend to face potential threats with rocks?" Vectar asked, unable to hide his disbelief. "We intend to comply with the peace accord," Sujin said firmly. The accord does not specify effectiveness, Overseer. It specifies technology. This technology is permitted. One of the younger humans, a woman named Mina, stepped forward. She patted the frame of the catapult. The wood is laminated for strength. The pivot is a custom alloy bearing. The rope is a synthetic polymer with incredible tensile strength. It is a very well-made machine. Vector let out a slow hiss, a sign of deep irritation. He saw other humans taking out other objects. Some were holding what looked like large, stiff bows with a strange locking mechanism. Crossbows. Others carried extremely long bows made of a layered material. Longbows. They were stringing them with great effort. They were bringing toys to a place that had known real war. Vector felt a sudden, strange pity for them. They were so primitive. They had disarmed themselves in spirit, not just in law. They had no real way to defend themselves now. The Kthari had honor. They would follow the accord. But surely the galaxy would see this? The humans were helpless. Very well, Vector said, handing the data pad back to Sujin. Your compliance is noted. The Kthari Concordance honors its word. Our advanced weapons are sealed. We will proceed with the cultural exchange period. He turned his back on the humans and their ridiculous wooden machines. He walked back to his line of warriors, who stood unarmed but confident in their physical strength and their rigid honor. Let the humans play with their sticks and stones. The true power on Irene was clear. It was orderly, logical, and advanced. It was Kthari. He did not see the look that passed between Jinwoo and Mina. It was not a look of fear or foolishness. It was a look of quiet calculation. Jinwoo watched the Kthari warriors, noting how they moved, how they clustered together. He looked at the lay of the land, the distance to the treeline, the direction of the wind. Mina ran her hand along the release mechanism of the catapult. All systems are nominal, she said softly, using engineering terms for a machine thousands of years old. Ready for live-fire exercises when ordered. Jinwoo simply nodded. The first move was done. They had passed inspection. The real work could now begin. The week after the weapon inspection was meant for cultural exchange. The Galactic Council believed sharing traditions would build trust. For the Kthari, this meant demonstrations of light sculpting, a peaceful art form using focused energy to create temporary shapes in the air. It was beautiful and harmless. For the humans of New Busan, their demonstration was listed as Terran Projectile Arts. Overseer Vector attended out of obligation. He stood with a few of his aides under a temporary canopy, watching as the humans set up targets on the far side of the field. The targets were simple round boards with concentric circles painted on them. Jinwoo stood before the small gathered crowd. Today, he said, we show a piece of human history. Long before electricity, humans used simple machines to store energy and release it with precision. We will demonstrate the crossbow. A younger man stepped forward. This was Taehyun. He moved with a quiet, fluid grace. He carried a device that looked like a short, heavy bow mounted on a stock. It was made of dark, polished material. Mina stood nearby holding a data recorder. This is a modern compound crossbow, Mina explained to the Kthari, her tone that of an engineer presenting specs. The limbs are carbon fiber. The string is a high-performance polymer. The projectile is a carbon bolt with a steel tip. The total draw weight is 150 kilograms. Vector listened. The numbers were impressive for a primitive tool, but meaningless. His personal shield could deflect a plasma bolt. A piece of sharpened carbon moving through the air was not a concern. Taehyun placed his foot in a stirrup at the front of the crossbow. He gripped the string with both hands and, with a strong, smooth pull, drew it back until it locked into place with a solid click. He then took one of the bolts from a quiver at his hip. It was about 40 centimeters long, perfectly straight. He laid it in a groove on the stock. He raised the weapon to his shoulder, looked down a simple optical sight, and breathed out. The release was a sharp, crisp thwack. The string snapped forward. The bolt became a blur. A moment later, there was a solid thud from 100 meters away. The bolt was buried deep in the center of the target. Vectar's aids shifted. The accuracy was notable. The power was more than expected. But the conclusion was the same. It was a slow, physical object. One of Vectar's warriors, standing nearby without his shield activated, whispered in their clicking language, "My scales are thicker than that target. It is a hunting tool for small game." Vectar nodded in agreement. "A precise tool," he said aloud to Jinwoo, his tone politely dismissive. "But against modern defenses it is nothing. A personal shield would stop it before it came close. The kinetic dispersal field reacts to speed. Your bolt, while fast for a tension weapon, is far too slow to even trigger the shield's high-level response." Jinwoo received this with a calm nod. "As you say, Overseer, it is a tool of a different time. Shall we continue?" The next demonstration was the longbow. A team of humans, men and women, formed a line. Their bows were as tall as they were, made of layered wood and fiberglass, curved into a graceful arc. They wore simple arm guards. At a command, they knocked arrows, drew the strings back to their ears in one unified motion, and let fly. A cloud of arrows rose into the sky with a sound like a flock of birds taking flight. They reached a high point and then fell, raining down on a distant, larger target area. They struck the ground in a tight grouping. It was a display of massed fire, of volume over precision. "An area denial weapon," Mina explained, still in her technical voice. "Effective against group targets before the advent of personal cover." Vectar saw the tactical concept archaic but coherent. It was like a weaker, slower version of their own cluster plasma charges. He was beginning to view the displays as a living museum, a lesson in how far the Kthari had evolved beyond such crude methods. But while the official demonstration continued, Taehyun had melted away from the group. His part was done. Now his real work began. He moved to the edge of the clearing, where the blue grass met the taller, purple foliage of the Irene forest. He carried a different device, a smaller, more compact crossbow. His job was not to watch the Kthari. His job was to watch everything else. Jinwoo had given him a theory. "Their technology is advanced," Jinwoo had said. "It is meant to fool other technology. Their stealth fields likely bend light and radar. Their sensors scan for energy signatures and metal. What does not look for a man standing very still under a tree?" Taehyun moved into the shadows. He became part of the landscape. He lifted a small pair of powerful binoculars, not electronic but simple magnifying lenses. He scanned the opposite tree line, the ridges overlooking the demonstration field. He looked for the wrong shape, the slight shimmer in the air on a windless day, a patch of color that moved wrong. He was not scanning for energy. He was using his eyes. And then he saw it. Near a cluster of large, mushroom-like trees, the light wobbled. It was like looking through heat haze off a road. He focused his glasses. The shimmer had a vague, bipedal outline. It was holding a long, thin object. A sensor probe or a sniper's weapon. A Kthari scout. They were observing the demonstration with active camouflage, a tool not banned by the Accord. Their technology made them virtually invisible to scanners. But to Taehyun's patiently searching eyes, the visual distortion was a clear flag. He watched the scout watch his friends. He noted the position, the distance, the line of sight. Back at the demonstration, Vectar was preparing to leave. He had seen enough. "Your historical arts are educational," he said to Sujin. "It is a reminder of the long path civilizations must walk. The Kthari walked it long ago." Sujin bowed her head slightly. "We are glad to share our path." As Vectar and his party turned to leave, Jinwoo caught a tiny movement from the forest edge. It was Taehyun, giving a prearranged hand signal. One finger tapped near his eye. Then two fingers pointed to a specific ridge. "One observer. Located." Jinwoo gave a barely perceptible nod. He walked over to Mina, who was packing away a chronometer used to time the arrow volley. "The demonstration was a success," he said quietly. Mina looked up. "On all levels?" "On all levels," Jinwoo confirmed. "They see only the tools. They do not see the toolbox. And we have confirmed that their advanced stealth has a very simple weakness. Mina allowed herself a small, hard smile. She looked at the powerful crossbow lying on its case. It was just a tool. But a tool was only as good as the hand that held it and the mind that directed it. The Kthari saw a slow bolt. They did not see the silent scout who could place that bolt exactly where it needed to go, not at a target board, but at a seam in armor, at a power cell on a belt, at the delicate controls of a device not designed for a physical impact. The cultural exchange was over. The humans had shown their toys. The Kthari had confirmed their assumptions. And in the quiet of the forest, Taehyun had gathered the first piece of real intelligence. The game was not about who had the better weapon. It was about who understood the field of play. And for now, the humans were the only ones who knew the other side was using stealth. Knowledge, Jinwoo thought, was also a weapon. And the treaty said nothing about that. Peace on Irene was a fragile thing. The formal talks had stalled. The humans of New Busan needed access to a northern river for water and irrigation. The Kthari claimed the land around it was rich in a mineral they used for their reactors. The disagreement was the whole reason for the war, and the reason for the uneasy peace. Chul, the leader of New Busan, sat in the simple command hut. He looked tired. Across from him were Sujin, Jinwoo, and Mina. A map of the region was spread on the table. The Kthari will not move on the river, Chul said. They say their claim is final. We cannot make them. The accord forbids force. We are stuck. The accord forbids advanced weapons, Jinwoo corrected softly. It does not forbid cleverness. Before anyone could ask what he meant, the ground shook. A deep, distant rumble echoed through the valley. It was not an explosion. It was the sound of something massive giving way. A young runner burst into the hut, her face pale. The reservoir. The north slope above the main reservoir is collapsing. They rushed outside. In the distance, a huge cloud of dust was rising. New Busan's primary water storage was a natural basin held by a rocky cliff. Now, a whole section of that cliff was sliding into the water, filling it with mud and stone. The sight was a physical blow to Chul. That water was life for the colony. Scout reports came in quickly. The cause was not natural. High-resolution images from a lookout post showed clear, straight lines of melted rock along the top of the cliff. The patterns were precise. They were the marks of a high-temperature industrial laser, the kind used for cutting and mining. The tool. Sujin demanded an immediate meeting with Overseer Vectar. It was held over a video link. Vectar's scaled face appeared on the screen. He looked calm. "This is a tragedy," Vectar said, his voice smooth. "But you must see it was an accident. A mining survey team was using a standard geological laser cutter to take core samples. The rock must have been unstable. The treaty clearly permits the use of industrial tools for peaceful development. That tool just destroyed our water supply." Chul snapped, his composure gone. "It was an unintended consequence," Vectar replied. "The Concordance regrets the loss. But we cannot be held responsible for the geological instability of your chosen reservoir site. Perhaps you should have chosen a more stable location." The link was cut. Chul put his head in his hands. The message was clear. The Kthari had found a loophole. They would use their tools to make life impossible for New Busan, all while keeping their hands clean and their honor intact. They had not fired a single plasma shot, but they had just launched a devastating attack. The mood in New Busan was bleak. The colonists began rationing water immediately. The sense of helplessness was thick in the air. They had followed the rules. They had brought their bows and catapults. And they had been made fools. In a workshop at the edge of the colony, Mina and Jinwoo pored over the geological survey maps. They were not looking at the reservoir. They were looking at the land around the main Kthari forward outpost, which was positioned on a wide, open plain. "The accord forbids weapons," Mina said, her finger tracing a line on the map. "But it says nothing about construction." Jinwoo nodded slowly. "Vectar views our machines as simple, a thing that throws. He sees the projectile, not the purpose." "What if the purpose isn't to destroy?" Mina asked, a spark in her eyes. "What if the purpose is to build?" Jinwoo pointed to a specific coordinate near the Kthari outpost. It was a low hill just outside the official neutral zone. They have their patrols here. They feel safe because they can see for kilometers. Nothing can approach without being seen. Unless the approach is from above, Mina said. They called in Taehyun and a team of their strongest and smartest workers. Jinwoo laid out a new plan. It was not a plan for attack. It was a plan for a statement. Over the next 3 days, under the hot sun, the humans worked. They used their heavy lift vehicles to carry pre-cut timbers and massive bags of gravel to the top of the hill. They were not hiding. They were building in plain sight. When a Kthari patrol approached on their silent skimmers, Sujin was there to meet them. "We are engaging in a cultural construction project," she explained calmly. "A monument to peace. The treaty encourages such exchanges." The Kthari warriors looked at the strange wooden framework rising on the hill. It looked like a huge throwing arm on a giant pivot. It was, in fact, the largest trebuchet they had yet built. They saw humans hauling bags of rocks and stacking them neatly. It looked like primitive, hard work. The patrol reported it as a pointless human ritual and left them to it. Mina was the lead engineer. This was not a simple catapult. This was a machine of precise engineering. She used laser levels and ancient trigonometry to calculate the exact pivot height, the weight of the countermass, and the length of the sling. The projectiles were not rough stones. They were large, heavy blocks of a fast-drying concrete mix, cast into aerodynamic shapes. Others were prefabricated sections of a metal fence post, sharpened at one end. The Kthari in the outpost watched the monument grow with mild amusement. They called it the human's folly. Finally, the machine was complete. It stood against the sky like a skeletal beast. Jinwoo received the report he was waiting for. Another Kthari mining laser team had been spotted moving toward a secondary water pipeline. He gave the order. At the hill, Mina checked the final calculations. Taehyun, acting as spotter, used his binoculars to locate the exact target zone. An empty stretch of ground directly between the Kthari outpost and its main access road. He relayed the distance and wind. The massive counterweight was loaded. A concrete block, smooth and heavy, was placed in the sling. Mina personally pulled the release pin. There was a deep groan of wood and fiber. The weighted end dropped. The throwing arm whipped upward. The sling unfolded at the perfect moment, launching the block into a high, soaring arc against the blue sky. From the Kthari outpost, it was a startling sight. A dark shape flying through the air, silent and slow. It was not coming at them. It was coming down in front of them. It landed with a ground-shaking crump half a kilometer away, digging a deep crater and throwing up dirt. Before the dust settled, another shape was in the air. Then another. The outpost alarm sounded. Warriors rushed to positions, but they were confused. They were not under direct fire. The huge blocks were landing in a rough line, one after another with terrifying consistency. They were not exploding. They were just impacting. Then the payload changed. The next launch sent a cluster of the sharpened metal posts screaming down. They plunged into the earth with deep thunks, landing in a tight pattern between the already fallen blocks. In less than 10 minutes, it was over. The giant machine was still. The dust cleared. Overseer Vector, from his command post, stared at the video feed. What he saw was not a scene of destruction. It was a scene of creation. A formidable, zigzagging wall of massive concrete blocks and impaling stakes now stood across the main approach to his outpost. It was a barrier, a fortification, built instantly from a distance of 2 kilometers. The human comm channel buzzed. Sujin's voice was calm. "Overseer Vector, we trust you observed our cultural demonstration? We call it rapid landscape architecture. We felt it was a fitting response to your own geological survey work. The Accord, we believe, permits such tools for construction." There was a long silence from the Kthari side. Vector stared at the newly built wall. They had not harmed a single one of his people. They had not used a single illegal weapon. They had used a primitive machine to perform a tactical engineering feat that his plasma casters could never do. A cold, hard understanding began to dawn in his mind. He was not dealing with primitives. He was dealing with people who read the rules and saw not limits but instructions. And they had just built a wall he could not argue against. The game had changed. The wall stood. It was a quiet, solid fact on the plains of Irene. For the humans of New Busan, it was a symbol. They were not helpless. For Overseer Vector and the Kthari, it was an insult carved in stone and metal. They were used to war fought with energy and fire, not with building supplies. Vector's pride was wounded. His warriors were restless. They could not attack the humans directly without breaking the accord. But the accord said nothing about the air above the neutral zone. Their utility sleds, used for moving cargo, used anti-gravity drives. They were tools, not weapons. A plan formed in Vector's mind. It would be a show of force, a reminder of Kthari superiority, without breaking the rules. The next morning, 5 sleek Kthari sleds, each piloted by a single warrior, rose from their outpost. They skimmed silently over the blue grass towards the human settlement. They carried no plasma casters. Instead, their sleds were loaded with loose rock and scrap metal collected from their mining sites. From a watchtower in New Busan, the alarm was raised. Chul watched the sleds approach with a sinking heart. "They are going to drop debris on us," he said. "They will wreck our solar panels, our greenhouses. They will say it was an accident, a load that came loose." Jinwoo stood beside him, his face calm. "They are using the sky as their high ground. They think we cannot reach it." "But we cannot," Chul said, frustration in his voice. "Our weapons are for the ground. Our catapults cannot shoot straight up. Our arrows cannot reach that height." "We do not need to reach the sleds," Jinwoo said. "We only need to take away their sky." He had prepared for this. He had known the Kthari would look for new advantages. He gave a series of quiet orders. Teams of humans, who had been training for this moment, moved quickly. They did not run to the big trebuchet. They ran to storage sheds and pulled out different devices. These were ballistas. They looked like giant crossbows mounted on heavy tripods. Their arms were thick with coiled polymer ropes, storing immense energy. They were not meant to fire bolts. They were meant to fire heavy, hooked grappling heads attached to hundreds of meters of thin, incredibly strong cable. Taehyun led a team to a rocky outcrop that overlooked the planned approach path of the sleds. Mina was with another team on the opposite side of the settlement. They worked with a quiet urgency. The ballistas were heavy, but they were designed to be taken apart and carried. They assembled them with practiced hands. The Kthari sleds came closer. They gained height, preparing to pass over the colony and release their loads of rubble. The lead pilot saw the humans scrambling below. He saw the strange, large crossbows. He felt a moment of caution, but dismissed it. What could a bolt do to an anti-gravity sled? The shield would deflect it. Even if it hit, it would be like a bug on the hull. Taehyun peered through the sight of his ballista. He was not aiming at the sleds. He was aiming at a specific point on the cliff face high above him. It was a crack in the rock. Mina was aiming at a tall, dead tree on her side of the valley. Their calculations were not about hitting a moving target. They were about geometry. "Fire!" Jinwoo's voice came calmly over the radio. The 2 ballistas released at the same moment. There was a deep thrum of released tension. The grappling heads, trailing their almost invisible cables, shot upwards. They were not fast like a bullet, but they had a heavy, powerful flight. The Kthari pilots saw the projectiles and instinctively veered away. But the hooks were not coming for them. Taehyun's hook flew into the crack in the cliff and bit deep. Mina's hook wrapped around the thick branch of the dead tree and anchored itself. For a second, nothing happened. The sled pilots hesitated, confused. Then, the humans at each ballista began cranking furiously. The winches pulled the cables taut. In moments, a single strong line was stretched across the valley, high in the air, connecting the cliff to the tree. The lead Kthari pilot understood too late. He pulled his sled up sharply to avoid the cable. The sled behind him swerved the other way. The sudden, uncoordinated movement spoiled their formation. "Second line, fire!" Jinwoo ordered. 2 more ballistas launched their cables from different positions. These hooks anchored into other rocks and trees. Now a web of cables began to form in the airspace over New Busan. The cables were not strong enough to slice a sled in half, but they were more than strong enough to snag one, to tangle in its anti-gravity veins, to trip it like a wire. The sky was no longer open. It was becoming a trap. Panic spread among the Kthari pilots. They were not combat flyers. They were utility operators. Their sleds were not built for tight maneuvers in a cluttered sky. One pilot, trying to turn away from a cable, drifted sideways. His sled's port vanes brushed against another cable. There was a shudder, a horrible scraping sound. The cable wrapped around the vane, jerking the sled to a sudden, lurching halt in midair. It hung there, stuck, its engines whining in protest. Another sled, trying to avoid its trapped companion, dumped its load of rocks early to gain speed. The rubble harmlessly scattered in an empty field. The pilot then turned and fled back towards the Kthari outpost, the mission forgotten. On the ground, the humans did not cheer. They reloaded the ballistas. They launched more cables, not at the fleeing sleds, but into new positions, weaving a denser web. They were not trying to destroy. They were building an aerial fence. The message was clear and undeniable. The humans had taken control of their own airspace without firing a single shot at the enemy. They had used the treaty's allowance for tools to create a defensive system. The Kthari's advantage in mobility was gone. Vector watched the whole humiliating retreat on his video feed. One sled was still caught, dangling like a fly in a spider's web. The others had returned, their pilots shaken. They had not been attacked, yet they had been utterly defeated. He slammed a scaled fist on the console. This was impossible. They were being outthought by machines made of wood and string. The humans were not fighting with power. They were fighting with problems. They turned every situation into an engineering puzzle, and they solved it with terrifying creativity. A junior officer approached cautiously. Overseer, the human diplomat Sujin, is on the comm, she says. She offers to send a climbing team to safely disentangle our sled. She says it is the neighborly thing to do. Vector felt a hot rush of shame and anger. They were not just being beaten. They were being pitted, helped. The humiliation was complete. Tell her yes. Vector hissed, the words tasting bitter. And tell the pilots they are grounded until further notice. He stared out at the plains. The human settlement looked quiet and peaceful. But he now saw it differently. It was not a collection of primitive huts. It was a fortress defended by ingenuity. The real weapons of humanity, he was beginning to understand, were not their crossbows or their catapults. Their real weapons were their minds. And those the peace accord could never ban. A heavy silence had fallen over the Kthari outpost. The shame of the failed sled attack was a physical weight. The warriors, used to clear superiority, now felt a confused anger. They had followed the rules, and the rules had been used to make them look foolish. Overseer Vector could feel their discontent. His own control was slipping. He needed to reassert their strength, but within the confines of the accord. He decided on a direct physical challenge. The treaty did not forbid movement or patrols. He would lead his personal honor guard on a walk to the very edge of the neutral zone. They would be unarmed, as per the agreement, but they would not hide. Their presence alone would be a statement. Their personal energy shields, a defensive technology, would be active. The shimmering bubbles would be a visible reminder of the technological gulf between them and the humans. Let the humans look upon their perfect defense and know their primitive sticks were useless. The message was sent to New Busan. It was not a request. It was a notification. Vector and 12 of his finest warriors would walk the boundary at midday. In the human colony, the message was met with concern. It's a show of force, Sujin said. They want to remind us of the limit of our power. They stand behind a shield we cannot break. Jin Wu studied the message. Their shield is designed for our age, he said. It reacts to high-speed impacts. Plasma bolts, railgun slugs, explosives. It senses the sudden force and disperses the energy. Mina, who had been running simulations in her workshop, looked up. But what if the impact isn't sudden enough to trigger it? What if it's just persistent? Taehyun, who had been cleaning one of his crossbows, listened. A shield is a machine. Machines have weaknesses. Mina opened a case. Inside were several crossbow bolts, but they looked wrong. The tips were not sharp. They were bulbous, rounded, and made of a brittle, ceramic-like material. I've been working on these. The shell is thin and fragile. Inside is a non-Newtonian gel. It's fluid until you hit it fast. Then it becomes solid. And it's highly conductive. Jinwoo picked one up, understanding dawning. The shield won't see a fast-moving penetrator. It will see a slow-moving splash. Exactly, Mina said. The bolt travels slowly for a weapon, below the shield's trigger threshold. On impact, the head shatters. The gel splatters across the shield's emitter matrix. The sticky and conductive. It should short out the localized field generator. It might not work, Taehyun said, his practical mind assessing the risk. Then we will have learned something, Jinwoo replied, and we will not have fired a single illegal shot. At midday, the Kthari arrived. They marched in a tight formation, their gray scales polished, their posture perfect. Around each of them glowed the faint, shimmering bubble of their personal shield. The air around them hummed softly with power. They stopped at the marked boundary line. Vector stood at the front, looking across at the humans who had gathered on their side. The humans were not in formation. Jinwoo, Mina, Taehyun, and a small security team stood casually. They held their crossbows, but the weapons were not raised. They looked more like workers holding tools. Vector's voice carried across the short distance. We walk our line. You walk yours. This is the peace. Remember the difference between us. Our protection is inherent. Yours is historical. It was a clear insult. The Kthari warriors stood motionless, their shields glowing, impervious and proud. Jinwoo took a step forward. He spoke calmly. All technology has parameters, Overseer. All machines have tolerances. Peace is understanding limits. He gave a slight nod to Taehyun. Taehyun moved with quiet efficiency. He loaded one of the strange, bulbous bolts into his crossbow. He did not aim at Vector. He aimed at the ground a few meters in front of the Kthari leader's feet. He raised the weapon and fired. The thwack was familiar to the Kthari now. They saw the bolt leave the bow. It was not a blur. It was clearly visible, tumbling slowly through the air. Vector almost laughed. It was so pitifully slow. It would bounce harmlessly off his shield, if it even reached that far. The bolt arced down and struck the energy shield in front of Vector's feet. There was no loud impact. There was a wet splat. The ceramic shell shattered on the shield's surface. A mass of thick, silvery gel splashed across the shimmering field, sticking to it like paint. For a second, nothing happened. Then, where the gel was stuck, the shield began to flicker. A web of sparkling, angry energy crackled across the surface of the bubble. The hum of the shield rose to a high-pitched whine. There was a sharp pop like a small electrical explosion, and a smell of ozone. The shield in front of Vector vanished. A quarter of his protective bubble was simply gone, leaving a ragged, gaping hole. The gel dripped down and sizzled on the ground. Astonished silence fell over the Kthari. They stared at the gap in Vector's defense. It was impossible. A primitive bolt had done what a plasmacaster could not. It had not overpowered the shield. It had tricked it. It had gummed up the works. Before anyone could react, 2 more thwacks sounded. 2 more gel bolts flew. They were not aimed at warriors. They were aimed at the shields of the warriors on either side of Vector. Both bolts splattered. Both shields flickered, sparked, and died in patches. In less than 10 seconds, 3 of the Kthari's finest stood partially exposed. The invincible barrier was shown to have a critical flaw. The humans had not just found it. They had demonstrated it with calm, surgical precision. The remaining Kthari warriors instinctively closed ranks, their shields overlapping, but the confidence was broken. They looked at the humans not with disdain, but with a new, wary fear. What other weaknesses did these humans see? Jinwoo lowered his hand. The humans did not fire again. They simply waited. Vectar looked down at the smoking gel on the ground. He looked at the dead space where his shield had been. The cold understanding that had been growing in him now froze solid. This was not a fight about technology levels. It was a fight about understanding. The humans understood his machines better than he did. They did not see a wall. They saw a system. And every system could be hacked, even with a splatter of goo. His great display of power had turned into the ultimate humiliation. His honor guard was not standing protected. They were standing exposed, their greatest defense proven fragile before their eyes. Without a word, Vectar turned. His movements were stiff. He began to walk back the way he came. His warriors, their proud formation broken, followed quickly. The glowing bubbles of their shields looked different now. They no longer looked like strength. They looked like targets. On the human side, Taehyun unstrung his crossbow. Mina made a note on her datapad about the gel's conductivity performance. They will not try a show of force again, Jinwoo said quietly. Sujin watched the retreating Kthari. No, she said. Now they will be truly angry. And an angry enemy who feels cornered is unpredictable. The next move will not be a show. It will be real. The mood in the Kthari outpost had turned dark. The shame was gone, burned away by a hotter, more dangerous feeling, rage. Overseer Vectar sat in his command chair, the images of the failed patrol and the splattered shields playing in his mind. His warriors muttered around him. They felt mocked. Their technology, their honor, their very way of war had been made to look stupid by creatures who fought with glue and ropes. A senior officer, his scales tight with anger, spoke. Overseer, we cannot allow this. They dance around the words of the treaty and make us look weak. The humans have no real power. They have tricks. We should end this. One strike. We reactivate the plasma cannons. We erase their settlement from orbit. The Galactic Council will protest, but they will understand once we show them the humans' provocations. Vectar was silent for a long time. The idea was tempting. A clean, quick return to the natural order. But he saw the flaw. If we do that, he said, his voice a low rumble, we prove them right. We prove that our way is only about destruction. That we cannot win within the rules they have twisted. No, we will end this, but we will do it in a way that leaves no doubt. We will crush them within their own game. He stood up, his decision made. We will gather every warrior. We will march to their settlement. We will not bring any weapon banned by the Accord. We will bring our strength, our numbers, and our tools. Mining lasers to cut through their walls. Grapple saws to dismantle their machines. And our personal shields, set to maximum dispersion. We will walk through their toy arrows and push over their wooden towers. We will dismantle New Busan with our hands and show the galaxy that primitivism cannot stand before true, orderly force. It was a plan of sheer, overwhelming pressure. It used the Accord's loopholes not with cleverness, but with brute force. 100 Kthari warriors, armed with industrial tools and shielded by technology the humans had only partially compromised, would be an unstoppable tide. The humans could not stop them without breaking the treaty themselves. The Kthari war machine began to move. Warriors prepared their shields. Technicians calibrated cutting lasers and powered up heavy saws meant for clearing rock. It was not a stealthy operation. Vectar wanted the humans to see it coming. He wanted them to feel the hopelessness. In New Busan, the scouts saw the activity. The reports were grim. Taehyun watched through his binoculars from a high ridge. They are not hiding it, he said over the radio. They are forming up. They have cutting tools. They look angry. This is it. They are coming to walk right through us. Inside the command hut, the atmosphere was tense. Chul's face was pale. This is what we feared. They will use their tools as weapons and dare us to stop them. If we use any advanced weapon, we break the Accord and give them permission to wipe us out. If we do nothing, they will dismantle our home around us. Sujin looked at the treaty document on her screen. There is no clause against a peaceful protest or a work crew, she said, her voice tight. They have found their own brutal loophole. All eyes turned to Jinwoo. The old historian had been quiet, studying a map of the settlement's perimeter. He finally looked up. His face was serious but not afraid. "They have chosen the direct path," he said. "The path of force. They believe that because we have no power, we have no defense. They are wrong. The strongest defense is not a wall you cannot pass. It is a path you do not want to take." He began to give orders. They were not orders to fight. They were orders to prepare the ground. As the sun began to lower, casting long shadows, the Cathari force marched out of their outpost. They moved in a wide, menacing line across the plain. The hum of 100 personal shields was a deep chord in the air. The light glinted off the cutting tips of their industrial lasers. It was a terrifying sight. From the walls of New Busan, the humans watched them come. They did not raise their bows. They did not man the big catapults. Instead, they opened the main gates. Then they stepped back out of sight. This gave Vector a moment of pause. Was it a surrender? A trick? He ordered the advance to continue. They would enter the settlement and begin their systematic dismantling. The first warriors passed through the open gate. The wide central path of the colony stretched before them, empty. The buildings on either side were quiet. The silence was unsettling. Then, from the rooftops and windows, humans appeared. They were not soldiers. They were cooks, gardeners, mechanics, and children. They held no weapons. They held slingshots, not the toy kind. These were large, carefully made staff slings. With a unified, practiced motion, they began to whirl them above their heads. They released. What flew through the air was not stones. It was small clay pots. Hundreds of them. They sailed in high, looping arcs over the advancing Cathari and shattered on the ground at their feet, not on their shields. The pots did not explode. They released a thick, pungent, greasy smoke that smelled of rotten eggs and burned herbs. It was not poisonous, but it was instantly, overwhelmingly disgusting. It stung the Cathari's sensitive eyes and filled their nostrils. The neat formation broke as warriors coughed and stumbled, their clear visibility gone. From other rooftops, another volley flew. These pots were larger. They hit the ground and burst open, not with smoke, but with a flood of clear, sticky liquid. It was a powerful industrial adhesive, non-toxic but incredibly tenacious. It splashed across the ground, coating boots and the lower parts of shields. Cathari warriors stepped into it and found their feet sticking fast. They tried to pull free and lost their balance, falling into the goo. The orderly march became a chaotic, sticky mess. They were not being hurt. They were being annoyed, hampered, and humiliated on a massive scale. Then the big machines engaged. The trebuchet on the hill, repositioned, began to launch its payloads. But not stones or posts. It launched huge nets woven from stretchy, unbreakable fibers. The nets sailed over the walls and fell onto groups of Cathari. The nets clung to their shields, tangling them together, making it impossible to move or use their tools. A ballista bolt, fired from a hidden position, thudded into the ground in front of Vector. It was not a hook. It was a speaker. A recorded human voice, calm and clear, began to play on a loop in the Cathari language. "You are violating the peace. You are trespassing. Your actions are being recorded for the Galactic Council. Please retreat." Vector stood in the middle of the chaos. He was not injured. None of his people were seriously hurt, but they were utterly neutralized. They were stuck, blinded by smoke, tangled in nets, and deafened by a polite recorded message. His mighty force, armed with cutting-edge tools, had been stopped by smoke bombs, glue, nets, and words. He looked around at the mess. His warriors were helpless. He could give the order to power up a plasma caster and burn it all away. But he saw the human observers on the roofs, recording everything. If he did that, he would lose everything. The fight had left him. This was not war. This was something else, something absurd and unbeatable. With a gesture of utter defeat, he signaled the retreat. The Cathari began the long, slow, sticky, humiliating process of pulling themselves free and stumbling back the way they came, leaving behind tools stuck in glue and their pride in tatters. The human settlement remained untouched. They had not won by force. They had won by making the very idea of attacking them seem ridiculous and pointless. The field between the outposts was quiet. The only signs of the previous day were a few discarded tools stuck in puddles of hardened glue and the trampled bluegrass. The Kthari force had retreated in a silence heavier than any noise. Inside their outpost, Overseer Vectar had not spoken for hours. The anger had burned away, leaving something hollow and cold. He had tried every form of pressure the Accord allowed, and each had been turned against him. The humans did not fight with strength. They fought with solutions. A request came from New Busan. Sujin asked for a meeting, not over a screen, face-to-face in the neutral zone. No guards, no shields, just two leaders. Vectar almost refused, but the hollow feeling inside him demanded an answer. He needed to understand. He went alone. In the center of the field, a simple table and 2 chairs had been set up. Sujin was already there. She stood calmly, her hands empty. Vectar approached, his tall frame casting a long shadow. He sat down, the chair too small for him. They looked at each other. "You have won," Vectar said, the words like stones. "You have made a fool of the Kthari Concordance. Is that why you called me here? To see your victory?" Sujin shook her head slowly. "No, Overseer. We have not won. We have survived. There is a difference. Winning means someone loses. We do not want you to lose." Vectar hissed in disbelief. "You have done nothing but make us lose face at every turn." "You focused on the weapon," Sujin said, her voice steady. "We focused on the problem. The peace accord was never about who had the most power. It was a test. Could 2 very different peoples resolve a conflict without annihilating each other? Your tools are for cutting and burning. Our tools were for thinking and building. You saw our catapults as things that throw rocks. We saw them as machines that could place a foundation stone with precision from 2 kilometers away." She placed a small data slate on the table and slid it toward him. "The original problem was the river. You need the mineral. We need the water. We have been working on this since the day you sealed your plasma cannons." Vectar looked at the slate. On it were complex schematics, fluid dynamics models, and geological surveys. It was a plan for an aqueduct system, a series of channels and pipelines that would draw water from the river's high point before the contested mineral-rich land and carry it to New Busan. A separate, parallel system would divert sediment and channel it to a collection point easily accessible for Kthari mining. It was an elegant, shared solution. "The support structures," Sujin said, pointing to the designs. "The weight calculations, the parabolic arcs for the water flow. We used the same mathematics that guide our trebuchets. The machine that built a wall to stop you can also build the foundation for a pipeline to help us both. The tool does not care. Only the mind that aims it cares." Vectar stared at the plans. He saw not just engineering, but a completely different way of thinking. The humans had been fighting a war, yes, but they had also been engineering the peace at the same time. Every defensive move was also a demonstration of a constructive skill. Their weapons were not meant to kill. They were meant to persuade. "Why show me this now?" he asked, his voice quieter. "Because the demonstrations are over," Sujin said. "We have shown you that we cannot be pushed. Now we must show you that we can be worked with. You came here for resources. So did we. The galaxy is full of enemies. It does not need another pair. It needs partners who are creatively persistent." Back in New Busan, Jinwoo, Mina, and Taehyun watched from a distance through binoculars. They saw Vectar pick up the data slate. He studied it for a long time. "Do you think he will accept it?" Mina asked. Jinwoo lowered his glasses. "He is a logical being. He has been offered a face-saving solution that gives his people what they need. And he has been shown that the cost of refusing is not destruction, but endless, frustrating, non-lethal resistance. It is the harder path for him, but it is the only sensible one." On the field, Vectar finally put the slate down. He looked at the human settlement, then back at his own outpost. He thought of the nets, the glue, the maddening voice recordings, the wall built in minutes. He thought of the calm, precise shot that had shorted out his shield. He saw not an enemy, but a problem solver of terrifying ingenuity. An enemy you could bomb. A problem solver would just find another way. This aqueduct, Vector said slowly. The primary support column. It is on a difficult slope. It would require precise placement of heavy materials. Sujin nodded. It would. Our engineering team has some experience with precise placement of heavy materials from a distance. A sound came from Vector then. It was a low, rough clicking. After a moment, Sujin realized it was the Kthari equivalent of a dry, exhausted laugh. You would use your war machine to build a piece, he said. It was never a war machine, Sujin replied. It was always a construction crane. You just never asked what we were building. Vector stood up. He was still proud, but the rigid anger was gone. I will have my engineers look at these plans. We will send our data on the mineral seams. If the numbers are good, then we will build. He turned to leave, then paused. He looked back at Sujin. Your people. You read the rules and saw a playground. Sujin smiled for the first time. We read the rules and saw the only thing that matters, the space between the words. That is where the future gets built. A week later, the big trebuchet was moved again. Its first payload was not a stone or a net. It was a crate of high-grade construction sensors, a gift from the Kthari miners to the human engineers. The massive arm swung, the counterweight dropped, and the crate sailed in a perfect arc across the plain, landing softly in a bed of prepared mulch exactly where the joint construction site was being set up. From his outpost, Vector watched the delivery. He then ordered his own technicians to begin a study of torsion and tension mechanics. Not for war, for construction. The first foundation of the shared aqueduct was laid that afternoon. It was a single massive stone, placed not by a Kthari lifter, but by the precise, patient, and peaceful arc of a human catapult. The war for Irene was over. The building had begun.